You're listening to Hear This Idea, a podcast showcasing new thinking in philosophy, the social sciences, and effective altruism. In this episode, we talked to Keith Frankish. He is a philosopher of mind and an honorary reader at the University of Sheffield, a visiting research fellow with the Open University, and an adjunct professor at the University of Crete. You'll also notice on this episode that Luca has been replaced by our first ever guest interviewer, Rob Long. Rob is a research fellow here at the Future of Humanity Institute, and he was able to bring some philosophy of mind knowledge to the conversation, which was extremely useful. Incidentally, we're thinking about trying out this format more often, with one of us swapping out for a guest interviewer. So let us know if you thought this one went well. Now, Keith is especially well known for really introducing and defending a view about consciousness called Illusionism. So here's me trying to explain the idea. It might feel like there is something it is like to be you right now, hearing my voice, seeing whatever you're seeing, and specifically, in addition to the way you're reacting psychologically to what I'm saying and what you're seeing, and alongside all of this, information processing, you might think there's a kind of extra raw experience. There are some extra distinctive sensory qualities. And these experiences might seem in some sense intrinsic or private to you, kind of ineffable maybe. You might even think that they're not physical, right? Really hard to imagine how they could be reducible to, a bunch of neurons firing in your head or whatever. And this kind of raw experience is what philosophers sometimes call phenomenal consciousness. Now, illusionism says that this kind of raw, private, sensory experience is just not real. In other words, you are not in fact phenomenally conscious at all. And the strong impression that you might have that you are in fact conscious is a kind of trick or a fiction, which your brain kind of plays on itself or tells to itself or something. Keith does a much better job of explaining this view at length in the podcast, so stick around if this sounds unclear. One reason I really wanted to speak to Keith was to ask him about the ethical implications of illusionism. Because it's very natural to link together questions about ethics, that is, what we should do, with questions about consciousness. For instance, it seems like some mental states are kind of intrinsically good or bad, and in some sense this could be a guide for what outcomes we should try to avoid or reach, and which kinds of creatures we should care for. And then that might motivate you to try figuring out which non-human animals are conscious, or you might even start wondering about which kinds of AI might eventually be conscious. But Keith basically denies that there are intrinsically good or bad mental states at all. And so I think he nuances and complicates this picture in all sorts of just really compelling and interesting ways. So thanks very much to Rob for joining me on this one, and without further ado, here is Keith Frankish.
My name's Keith Frankish. I'm a philosopher. I worked for a long time at the Open University in the UK, writing course material. I still have affiliations with the various universities in the UK, and I do some teaching here at the University of Crete, but I spend most of my time writing these days. I write mostly about consciousness. I think consciousness is a subject that fascinates people. It's a subject that we all feel quite deeply about. I think it's very intimate. Our consciousness is what we really are, in a way. But I think we're often quite confused about it. And I'm trying to think more clearly about it myself, and trying to help other people to think more clearly about it.
And I suppose as a way to get more of a taste of what exactly you're currently preoccupied with, could you maybe tell us about some kind of problem or question that you're currently stuck on?
I'm stuck on two questions. One is the substantive question, which is thinking about what consciousness is and why we think about it in the way that we do. I just said that I think we're confused about consciousness. I think we misconceptualize our own consciousness. And I think that itself is a very interesting fact about us, that we tend to think of consciousness in this particular way. There's a kind of compelling picture of what consciousness is that we can't seem to detach ourselves from. And I think it's wrong. I think there's very good reasons for thinking this picture is wrong, and that it's actively misleading us and hindering our progress in all sorts of ways. But it's very hard to detach ourselves from that picture. And so one thing that really interests me is why we have this picture, if I'm right that it's wrong, and what that itself tells us about consciousness, that it's something that presents itself to us in this way. I'm also struggling with a practical question because, as I said, I'm increasingly trying to write for a wider audience, and I'm facing this problem of how to communicate about this. What I'm asking people to do in my work on consciousness is to rethink the nature of their own consciousness. And how do you get people to do that? It's not easy. It's not easy for me to hold this reconceptualized picture in mind. And it's hard to get it across to other people. I'm asking people to make a kind of, Daniel Dennett might call it an inversion or a sort of aspect shift in the way they think about consciousness. And it's hard to get them to do that. And now this is my problem, not their problem. And this is something that's an ongoing thing. I think you can see it in Dennett's work, that he's continually tried to develop new thought experiments, new analogies, new metaphors, new ways of trying to get people to see it, what he considers the right way. And I see myself as continuing to do that.
I really like what you said on the second point, which is that philosophers are fond of dealing in arguments. But if the question is, how do I change someone's mind to come around to a view which I think is right, does feel like the most effective way involves not so much leading them through arguments, but also presenting really interesting kind of new perspectives, analogies, thought experiments, little empirical examples, new angles or something. And I wonder if that is underrated in philosophical discourse, at least kind of public-facing discourse. But I'm sure in some sense, this conversation could be something like a test of that. And I suppose the real question has to do with the first problem you're stuck on, which is something like, well, people tend to hold a view of consciousness which you think is mistaken. And before we talk about that view, I guess we can talk about this big question that kind of motivates lots of different views about consciousness. This is often called the hard problem of consciousness. Now, whether or not you ultimately think this is a kind of good question to be asking, I would be keen to hear how you understand this question and just a little bit about how people begin to approach it.
It's very easy to say what the hard problem is. It's the problem of how the brain generates, produces consciousness. Okay, how does it do it? Now, but everything is packed into the question of what you mean by consciousness. Okay. And now, standardly what happens here when you're introducing this problem to students or to people who are interested in philosophy of mind is you start talking about what it's like to have experiences. You say, well, consciousness is what it's like to have visual experiences, auditory experiences. It's what it's like to see a brilliant blue sky, to taste coffee, to hear a violin playing or something, or whatever. And you get me out of these examples. And similarly with bodily sensations, what it's like to feel a pain in your toe or whatever. But very quickly you have to start clarifying things a bit here, because it seems that what you're saying is that it's what colours and sounds and tastes and things are like. And at first sight, colours and sounds don't seem to be mental things at all. They seem to be things in the world around us. Colours are features of objects on the basis of which we group some things together and distinguish things from each other there. So what is this, what it is likeness of the colour? If the colour's out there, what is it? And so you have to start making a distinction between the colours of things out there in the world, which is whatever it is we're picking up on when we categorize things in this way, and then the mental colour, what it's like to experience the colour, which seems to be another property. So there's the colour out there, whatever it is, some feature of the surface of an object that's reflecting light of certain wavelengths, and then that's sort of producing a kind of colour in our minds, which is often referred to as the quale of the colour in question, the qualia of yellow, the qualia of red, or whatever. Similarly, with pain seems to be something that occurs in our bodies. Pain is in my toe, and there's certainly some damage in my toe and some kind of stimulation there, but then it produces this pain qualia, it seems in my mind, which is what it's like to experience that pain. And this sort of line of thinking, this separation between the sort of the qualities in the world and the qualities that we experience, it's easy to sort of reinforce this by thinking about cases where you hallucinate or dream, whatever, where it seems all the mental qualities are there, but the appropriate worldly ones aren't. And it can seem that really it's these mental qualities, these mental colours and sounds and things that are all that we really know for sure. And now it looks like you really have got yourself with this way of starting to think about consciousness as this interior world. Once you've talked yourself into this way of thinking about it, which isn't hard to do, then you really seem to be stuck with a big problem, because this interior world seems to be radically private, as no one else can get access to it. I mean, you can tell them about it, but even then you're limited in how you can describe it. You can say, well, I'm having that experience that I have when I see yellow things, the experience that bananas produce. And how does the other person know that the experience bananas produce in them is the same as the one that it produces in you? They can't get into your private little mental world and have a look at these your mental qualities, and you can't get into theirs. Moreover, investigating your brain through neuroscience doesn't seem to help at all, because that neuroscience just doesn't show up this private world of mental qualities. It just shows neurons doing all sorts of wonderful things. So now you have this idea of, so how does the public brain, this massively complex biological organ of 80 billion interconnected neurons? I'm not sure the number.
86 or so?
Is it 86? Okay. And with how many interconnections? Innumerable. How does that produce this private world of mental qualities? That's the hard problem. And I think once you set it up in this way, I mean, I've done a little bit to set it up there, but you can do a lot more. Once you set it up in that way, I think you're presented with not merely a hard problem, but an impossible problem.
So there's this paper called The Meta Problem of Consciousness by David Chalmers, and you have written a response to this. And something that's at issue in this conversation you have with Chalmers is how much is baked into our concept of consciousness. So I think he would say, and Eric Schwitzgebel says things like this, whether consciousness is private, as you've been saying, or infallible, those are like substantive things we can say about consciousness, and those do make things very tricky. But what do you think of people who say there's actually just a more innocent conception of consciousness? That's Schwitzgebel's term. We don't have to think that it's necessarily private or infallible. We can still pick out this thing that we can wonder about. And it's this thing that visual experience has and mental imagery has, but that hormone release doesn't have, or, certain low-level things in muscle control or the regulation of heartbeat. You can wonder what the difference between those things is, just that namely that there's something that's like to be in the first and not the second. Yeah, what do you think about this more innocent approach?
I was with you till the last you sneaked in what it's like there. I think there is an innocent notion of consciousness. I'm very happy with it. It just doesn't pose a hard problem. Let's just point to some examples of conscious experiences. There's a light above me now. I'm looking at it. It's a sort of yellowy white. It's quite bright. It's flickering a little bit. I'm having a conscious experience. Okay. And then we could point to other things that are happening in me, perhaps things that my brain is doing that are not they're very like that at all. Yeah, here's a bunch of events that occur in me that we group together because they have some kind of common features. For one thing, I can tell you about them. That's one obvious thing. When I'm having a conscious experience, I'm able to describe it to you. Yeah, those things happen and they need explaining. But we've not got anything in that conception that presents a hard problem. There's no reason to think that whatever it is that we're talking about there isn't just some sort of complex set of functional processes in the brain. Now, consciousness as something that poses a hard problem is supposed to be something that resists conceptualization in functional terms. And it resists it because, well, you start waving your hands here and saying, well, it's just kind of purely qualitative. It's just a feel. It's a pure feel. It's not a matter of something happening, some process occurring like digestion, which we can conceptualize fully in functional terms. It's just a pure feel. And we could imagine all those feelings. We get into all these thought experiments, which are supposed to reveal something about consciousness, but I think just reveal or just reinforce a certain conception of consciousness.
I was wondering if I could try saying back the way you've been describing this conception of consciousness. So, as you've said, it does seem to most people, certainly to me, that among other things, my conscious experience is kind of private in the way that no amount of peering around my brain or me talking to other people can really communicate what it's like for me to be like tasting this coffee or seeing this color. It's also similarly kind of ineffable. For instance, if I were trying to tell a blind person what it's like to see the color red, I think it wouldn't only be difficult. I feel like it'd also just be impossible. Maybe red looks like the way a trumpet sounds or something, but I'm just not even getting close. And then finally, it really feels like this thing, consciousness, is in some significant way disconnected from the physical world or processes in that world, right? So I could imagine like blowing up my brain so I can walk through the neurons and, no matter what I look at, I won't see anything that I would recognize as consciousness. I could also imagine duplicating a brain in some other possible world and there being no kind of attendant experience, right? Just the people walk around but the lights aren't on or something. And all those thoughts kind of lead you to thinking that there's this question to be answered about how and why it is that on one hand we have physical processes and on the other hand we have the taste of coffee and the appearance of red. And you're saying, okay, I can see why people think this is a question, but I don't only think it's a hard question. I think it might be an impossible question.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly the conception of consciousness that's at the root of this. And yes, philosophers might say, well, I don't want to endorse all of those things, or maybe I want to have a watered down notion. But that's the notion that's causing the problem. That's the notion, this private mental world that is known to you in some very special way and is not accessible to other people or to scientific investigation. That's the notion that's causing the problem. That's why we think there's a hard problem. So long as you think there's a hard problem, you're endorsing at least substantial bits of that conception, yes. And I think it's probably the privacy that's at the root of it. The idea that this world isn't really, this mental world isn't really part of the public three-dimensional world that can be investigated by science. And of course, if you think of it in that way, then there's a hard problem, because how on earth does science science can't get hold of it. The most you can do is tell some story about how this private world is related to the world that science describes. Mm. So my challenge really is to that way of thinking. It's saying, no, I agree completely that that's how we tend to conceptualize our own minds. I feel the pull of that picture, I think, as strongly as anyone. But as Daniel Dennett would say, I don't trust it. I think my mind might be tricking myself about itself, as it were. And at the very least, we ought to consider this as a possibility. Because if the intuitions we have about this private mental world are right, then we are really very, very special bits of the universe. That somehow create these private worlds.
I liked the phrase, maybe our minds are tricking ourselves about themselves, or something along those lines.
Or our brains tricking ourselves about our brains, might be better.
Yeah. You are pointing at a kind of alternative conception of consciousness, which gets called illusionism about consciousness. We'll kind of, I guess, go into this slowly and maybe from different angles, because I happen to think it's just a very, very weird idea, or at least I find it very, very hard to wrap my head around. But maybe as a kind of first blush, could you tell us what illusionism is supposed to be saying and what it's answering exactly as well?
Well, it's saying that this conception of consciousness is first of all seriously mistaken, that these world of private mental colours and qualities and so on doesn't actually exist. Something exists that is causing our beliefs about this private mental world, that makes it seem to us in some sense that there is this mental world. And our talk about this mental world is certainly tracking things that are really happening. It's not that when we say, I'm having this experience, that nothing's happening, something's happening. But the way we conceptualize it is wrong. Our way of conceptualizing experiences involving this private, especially intimate acquaintance with peculiar non-physical properties, that's the wrong way of thinking about it. Though it's a natural way, and a way that is perhaps useful for talking about what's happening with us and communicating with other people. I'm not suggesting we give it up. I mean, another way of putting this, I suppose, is that introspection, the process of attending to our own mental states, to what's happening in our minds, is not reliable. This is something that in other areas, certainly in thinking about, say, belief and desire and emotions, so this is widely accepted that we often deceive ourselves about what we really think and believe and want. And but it seems surely we can't be deceiving ourselves about what we're actually experiencing right now. But I think we can certainly misconceptualize what's happening. I mean, another possible word for the position would be something like fictionalism, the idea that we are using a kind of fictional language. The language of this private mental world is a sort of fictional place with these fictional things, these things qualia occurring there, and some sort of fictional self appreciating them. And Daniel Dennett likes to characterize this common sense idea, this wrong idea, as a sort of internal private theatre where there's a self watching this display of color, of mental colors, and listening to a mental soundtrack, as it were. And this is quite a compelling picture, which I think even those who would say, well, of course, I don't believe anything like that, that this kind of picture still is there somehow in the background, shaping the things that they do believe.
I am interested to try drawing out just how possibly radical or weird or counter to common sense this view might sound to some people. And one way to do that is to explain how this is different from what gets called physicalism or materialism, or at least certain kinds of those views about consciousness. So lots of people I know will think, I don't think that consciousness is something kind of mysterious or magical or non-physical. I have this kind of private mental world. I see colors, sure. And I just happen to think that world is identical with or caused by my brain. I'm a scientist. In what ways is that kind of view different from the view you're expressing?
I think my view is much more commonsensical than the physicalist one.
Right.
Okay. So first of all, let's distinguish physicalism from another view that is often confused with physicalism. The view that's often confused with physicalism is the view that the brain somehow produces consciousness. Okay. That the stuff that's happening in the brain somehow creates these mental properties, these mental qualia, these mental colors and sounds and so on. That consciousness is a product of the brain. That's not physicalism. That's a sort of property dualism, because there's two sorts of properties. There's the brain properties, and then there are these mental properties that are produced by the brain. That's a weak form of dualism. Physicalism is the view that consciousness and these mental properties and so on just are states of the brain. So the feel of seeing a bright blue sky, the feel of a sharp pain in your toe just is certain activity in certain regions of your sensory cortex. It's just certain patterns of brain firing. That is the mental color. That is the pain, right? That's physicalism. Now, that seems to me, I cannot make sense of that view. I mean, the physicalist says these two things are the same. That I look at the vivid, brilliant blue sky above me, and that what I'm actually attending to when I attend to the blueness of the blue is actually some pattern of neuron firing in my brain. That's what it is. Well, it certainly doesn't look like it from the perspective of the neuroscientist investigating my brain. It doesn't look blue to them. I can't make sense of that identity.
I can imagine drawing an analogy to other things. So I am looking at what looks like a tiny Rob and a tiny Keith, but in fact I know it's just some array of pixels And because I'm, scientifically responsible, I'm a kind of pixelist about these images of people. And I've explained away the problem of how it is that a tiny Rob and a tiny Keith appear to be beaming in front of me. Is that not the same kind of thing that physicalists are?
Not really, it's an illusion. You're not actually looking at me. You're looking at pixels on a screen. That's more of an illusionist position. You're not actually seeing, those pixels aren't me. This is not a Keith. This is a picture of a Keith that you're looking at. So you've not really mistaken me for the pixels. That would be an astonishing category error. And similarly, I think the physicalist claim would be that I am the pixels. That I'm like sort of Max Headroom character. That's an old reference, probably too old for you. That I am just a two-dimensional digital being. That's the analogy. To me, illusionism is just clear-headed physicalism. And if you look back to the identity theorists of the 50s, the original identity theorists, people like Ulin Place and Jack Smart, they were pretty clear about this. Place talks about the phenomenological fallacy, the idea that this mental greenness, that there is such a thing as this. When you're looking at something green, that there is a mental greenness. No, there's just whatever happens when you normally see green things that's occurring. Mm-hmm. You're not aware of some mental version of green. You're just in the state that you're normally in when you see you're normally when you see green, whatever that happens to be, and that's for the neuroscientists to tell us what that is. But it's not then to say that state really is greenness. Mm-hmm. So this is, I say this is just clear-eyed physical. I think we've been going on a sort of detour. Physicalists are going on a detour for the last 30 or 40 years on this.
I see.
Trying to have their cake and eat it, trying to take these hard problem intuitions seriously and discharge, and respond in physical. I don't think you can do that.
Yeah, interestingly, it strikes me that this reaction you have to physicalism of how could I possibly make sense of that identity? How could this really explain greenness? That's something you share with non-physicalists. Both you and non-physicalists think that physicalism is just completely impossible to understand or to find satisfying.
Yeah, there's a certain conception of consciousness. Yes, I agree. And if you conceive of consciousness that way, when yes, you are making physicalism fairly inconceivable. But that's because of the way you've set it up. The trick is that this conception is introduced as being a really innocent one. It's if you have to ask, you ain't never going to get to know, and it's just the obvious thing. It's what it's likeness, but it's actually built on the back of a whole tradition of philosophical thought about this, particularly the skeptical thought. And I'm not sure it's as natural as I think you can get yourself in a frame of mind where it seems very natural and compelling and hard to get rid of. But surely the natural conception, just the sort of completely pre-theoretical conception, is that all these qualities that are supposedly produced by my brain are just out there in the world. Mm-hmm. That's the pre-theoretical. It's only when you get to get early modern science and you get the idea that the world out there doesn't have these qualities in it, that you start having a problem of consciousness. You have to put them in the mind. Okay, let's take a little detour. I guess sort of Aristotelian science just saw all these qualities, all this stuff is just out there in the world. This is incredibly sketchy history. Then you get early modern science, where the idea is you try and sort of mathematicize the world. That's a point that Philip Goff makes a lot of, and tries to describe the natural world in terms of the structure and dynamics of matter. And so then what happens to the qualities? What happens to the redness and the painfulness and all this stuff, and the sweetness and all these things? Well, you have to say, you could say, they're in us, they're in our souls. And people tended to believe in souls at that time. They thought souls were not part of the physical world. And so it was a convenient place to put this stuff. So you say, okay, there's this physical world doing all, doing all its stuff mechanically, and then there are souls which are filled with all these interesting qualities and stuff, and which is also the locus of free will and intellectual thinking and all these fancy stuff that you can't really explain in mechanical terms. And that's fair enough until you science starts to get rid of the soul itself and tells you that what you thought was a soul really is just a brain. And then you have difficulties because you put all this tricky stuff in there. Now you want to just be a mind-brain identity theorist. So what then do you do with this stuff? And the physicalists are trying to say, well, yeah, it's still kind of in there somehow. It's still, but it's now in the brain. You have to be more, a bit more radical, I think.
Yeah. One of the objections to this kind of illusionist view about consciousness, which occurs to lots of people when they hear about it for the first time, is, well, hang on. For there to be an illusion, doesn't that presuppose that it's an illusion for some kind of conscious observer or conscious experiencer? And I mean conscious in the kind of problem-generating sense. So certainly this seems to be the case for, visual illusion. If I'm experiencing some kind of illusory color where there's actually no real color there, but just some like dots which make it look like it's there, I, the experiencer, need to be there in the first place in order to be mistaken about what color I'm seeing, right? So it looks like, worst case, this illusionism thing is just kind of presupposing the thing it's attempting to explain away. And very best case, it's just kind of knocking the problem back one step, right? Because I just ask you, well, maybe the fact that I'm conscious is kind of an illusion, but it's an illusion for who? And so I suppose the question is something like, how can it be the case that I'm conscious in this problematic sense? How can that feeling be itself an illusion?
Okay, so that's a natural objection, and I can see its force. But I think it's presupposing the sort of view of consciousness that I'm asking people to reject, that the illusionist asks you to reject. And the reason is this, that you're thinking of an illusion, like say a perceptual illusion, as something that's experienced in this private mental world. So there isn't really, say, let's suppose it's a hallucination, let's say. So there isn't really a kind of pink elephant there in front of you, but there is a sort of pink elephant image in your private mental world. And your experience is constituted by what's happening in this private mental world, not by what's actually out there in the real world. Or take an illusion where you have a Muller-Lyer illusion, where you have two lines, one of which appears longer than the other. That one's not really longer than the other, but the version of those lines that's presented in your little mental world, one of the lines is longer than the other. So you're understanding illusions in terms of presentations in some private mental world. But if you think of illusions in that way, then the illusionist view of consciousness itself seems to be to have all the problems that you mentioned, because it seems that the illusionist is saying, oh, look, this private mental world that you seem to have is itself an illusion. So that, if you extend the same picture, seems to mean that you're going to have another private mental world in which there's a version of this private mental world being displayed. So there isn't really this private mental world any more than there's a pink elephant out there, but there is a kind of version of it being displayed in another mental world. So you're going to need a mental world after all in which to present the illusion of the first one. Well, the thing is, the illusionist says, don't think of illusions in that way at all. So don't think of perceptual illusions in that way as involving some presentation of mental shapes and colors and so on in a mental world. Think of them as producing a set of reactions in you, in particular beliefs. So one thing that the illusion of a pink elephant produces is the belief that there's a pink elephant there. So think of an illusion as something that produces all the psychological reactions typically produced by the real thing. Well, the real thing isn't there. And now we can tell the story about this inner world, of this inner private mental world. We can say that for there to be an illusion of a private mental world is for you to have all the reactions to be produced that would be produced by a real private mental world. So, for instance, you believe that there's a private mental world. You talk about this private mental world. You perhaps obsess about how to explain this private mental world. You have a lot of all the psychological reactions that would be produced by a private mental world with mental qualities and so on. And the thing that's experiencing the illusion is just you, the whole person. Just as you, the whole person, are having the reactions that are characteristic of seeing a pink elephant, so you, the whole person, having the reactions characteristic of having a private mental world in your head. So you don't need to have this second sort of presentation. There's no threat of a regress, and there's no need for some sort of inner person to witness this private mental world. So in order to get over the objection, you need to rethink what an illusion is. Now, that's a little bit of an awkward thing for the illusionist, because it looks as if, we're using a term that you already understand. And so, illusionism says it's consciousness is a kind of illusion, but you need to rethink what an illusion is in order to understand it. So that's a little bit of a defect in the name. But it is maybe an opportunity to explain the point better.
Very quick question. If you could go back, what are your top 3 alternative names for illusionism? You already mentioned fictionalism. Any other backup names that you would like?
Well, look, you could just call it irrealism. I kind of didn't like that because it seemed to be sort of just dismissing it. It's saying it's not real, forget about it. Now, illusion, on the other hand, suggests something that an illusion is a real psychological state. And illusions can be quite powerful. I know wars have been started over illusions, I guess. And religions started over illusions, using illusion quite broadly here. Illusions can be very powerful. I mean, in a way, fiction is drama, TV is an illusion. But it's a very powerful one that moves us and is quite important. Stage magic illusions, they're important, potent, powerful things that can move us and amuse us. And so I like the idea of illusion because it had a positive content for me. It wasn't just dismissing this. It was saying it's not what you think it is, but it's still quite important. So that's one reason I didn't like irrealism. I didn't like eliminativism either, because I don't think we should say eliminate talk of what experiences are like. We just need to understand what it's really doing, what its function is. So I don't like eliminativism. Fictionalism is probably the second best one, fictionalism. The reason I don't like fictionalism is because fictions are typically intentionally created. You make up a fiction. I'm certainly not making up this account of what my inner life is like intentionally. It's being made up for me. So it'd be a fiction created by some personal processes in my brain. Whereas if I call it fictionism, people would say, "Oh, you're saying that you're just making all this up."
You're calling me a liar? When I say that I see red?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Now, illusions, on the other hand, are typically not deliberately created in that way. So that was a point in its favor. I thought one's trying something to do with magic, but then because I really like the analogy with stage magic, because stage magic is all about creating a certain effect on the audience. And I was particularly influenced around that time by Nick Humphrey's work. He really is an illusionist, though he doesn't like the term. But he used this comparison with magic a lot, and his view then, and it's not really changed, I don't think, was that this is actually an adaptive feature, this illusion of this private mental world that evolution selected for, because it has all sorts of wonderful beneficial effects. And so it's a bit like evolution as a sort of magician crafting this illusion, carefully crafting this illusion to have a certain effect on us, on the audience. And another reason why I liked this idea of magic and illusion is because there's a nice analogy with consciousness, which is this: which when you know how the trick's done, it's always disappointing. It's always kind of mundane. It's just like the wonder you feel from at seeing the effect is completely sort of disproportionate to the to the actual apparatus that's used. It's often sort of trivial and inadequate to produce that effect. And that's a lovely analogy for, I think, thinking about the relation between the brain and consciousness. You think, how could just neurons firing produce our sense of this? Well, how could just sleight of hand maneuvers make it seem that this wonderful thing is happening? People often say to me, illusionism isn't an ideal name. Well, tell me a better one.
Naming it, I think, is important, though, right? Because often the success of some idea is attached to how catchy the name is.
I think it has worked in that respect. And another reason I chose it, I liked it, was because it is deliberately provocative, and I think that is important because you really do need to do a bit of work to reconceptualize consciousness in this way. I think this is where physicalists have been sort of selling us short. They say, it's all it is all you're really introspecting here is the patterns of neural activity.
What do you think explains why it seems like children naturally wonder if people see red the same way they see red? At least I've heard this reported. I seem to remember that I myself had this, and I don't think I had at that time much of a theoretical conception of primary qualities and secondary qualities. And this goes back to the topic that you're talking about at the beginning, which is what explains why we make these judgments. How much of it is maybe kind of baked in, such that children would naturally come to it, and how much of it comes from theorizing and things that we tell freshmen taking philosophy and so forth. What do you think about children wondering about this? Why do they do that?
These are the really interesting questions. Yeah, I think some of it is baked in. I think it's to do with the nature of introspection. I think we need a substantive story about what's going off here, what introspection is tracking. My gesture at this is that what it's tracking is something like what I've called it's creating a reaction schema. It's tracking the reactions that sensory stimulation is producing. By that, I don't mean behavioral reactions. I mean the whole complex suite of psychological reactions that are being triggered. That it's tracking the shape of those, the unfolding shape of the reaction schema. Which is certainly something private in one sense, in that it's in my head and it's my reaction. So the idea is that describing something as red. Maybe we should sort of approach this a bit more slowly. But the idea is that when talking about something as being red or painful, we're saying something about how it's affecting us. And I think that introspection is tracking obscurely how that complex pattern of reactive dispositions is unfolding and changing. When we say something's red, we're saying it's pushing it in one direction. When we're saying it's painful, it's another, and so on. And that's what we're getting at with this talk about the feel of experience. This explains the privacy point, because it is my reactions that are being tracked. And my reactions are mine in a very unmysterious way. They're not mine because they belong to some private world that is somehow strangely, intimately attached to my body. It's because they are just my reactions, not yours. But it's not too hard to see how it might create the sense of mystery.
So there is, I agree with Rob, I agree with you, Keith. It does sound like there is a really interesting question to be answered here, which is separate from the hard, quote unquote, hard problem, which gets called the meta problem of consciousness. This is something like the question of, irrespective of whether there is in fact a hard problem in the first place, why it is that when people kind of reflect on the fact that they feel conscious, that there's some really mysterious hard thing to be answered for in the first place, which as a matter of fact is the case. Lots of people go around saying there's a problem. People devote philosophy careers to trying to figure out this problem. They'll give lecture tours and so on. And the good thing about this problem is that you don't need to start answering the metaphysical, mysterious questions. Presumably, unless things are really weird, we can answer the question of why philosophy professors go and give lecture tours about the hard problem of consciousness in more or less theory-neutral, functional terms, in terms of what the hell their brains are doing and what people's brains are doing when they sit down and begin to introspect on their own experiences, and half an hour later they reach this point where they feel like there's something really hard to explain going on. In fact, something so hard to explain that it's almost mysterious or non-physical or baffling in some way. And you're kind of suggesting a piece of the answer, which is trying to explain why people have these intuitions about privacy of certain kinds of conscious experience. I wonder if there are other kinds of answers or other angles or pieces of that puzzle that you find especially interesting as well. Well,
this was the first substantive question that I mentioned at the beginning. This is what I think people should be focusing on. And let me make a methodological point here. I think we should be focusing on this first of all. I don't like the term the meta problem, because it implies, I think, that there is a first order problem, that there really is a hard problem. I wanted to call it the illusion problem. In fact, Dave Chalmers suggested I call it the illusion problem, but then that, of course, is question begging the other way.
Well, I don't mind the term. I know the meta problem of UFOs, which is something like, irrespective of whether UFOs are aliens, why do people keep thinking that they see UFOs with aliens inside them?
Yes, I suppose. Yes, I guess it's less question begging than calling it the illusion problem. Okay, now I think we should.
You could call it the quasi meta problem. It's a meta problem if realism is true.
I'm always tempted to stick the word quasi in front of something. Don't encourage me. But look, I think from a methodological point of view, that's the one we should be focusing on. Because suppose first of all, it's tractable. We know how to do it. More or less, it's not, doesn't present a hard problem. They're all easy problems in Chalmers terms. Problems that are approachable using the tools of cognitive science as we have it, or of modest extensions of that. So it's something we can get on and work on. And suppose we get a pretty good answer to that question. So we can say to someone who has all these, these intuitions, says consciousness is real mystery, I'm really puzzled about it. And we tell them this story about why it is that they have all these intuitions about the mysteriousness of consciousness, and why it seems that it's this strange private inner world with these ineffable properties and so on that doesn't seem to be physical and hang on to it. And we tell them this story. Now, two things might happen. They might go, oh, well, I guess that's it then. I'm not really puzzled anymore. It's just my brain doing all these complex things, as well as, processing all this information. It's also creating this sense that there's this strange inner world. But I'm not puzzled by it anymore. I don't think there is a strange inner world. And in that case, we've solved everything. Mm. Or they might say, yeah, okay, I understand all that, but I'm still absolutely convinced that there really is an inner world. And maybe if everybody feels absolutely convinced of that, even when we've solved the meta problem, then maybe we should start having a look at some of the realist theories. I don't know if that doesn't satisfy everyone, but let's see if we're satisfied with the meta problem story first, which we can get. I've argued that we should be satisfied with that, and that not to be satisfied with it would be rather like someone who believes in UFOs and then has a complete explanation of why they believe in UFOs, which doesn't actually mention real UFOs. It's all to do with optical illusions and weather conditions and whatever it is, and says, okay, I accept that you've explained away all my beliefs about UFOs without there being any UFOs, but I still think they're UFOs because I can just tell they're there. But anyway, methodologically, we should start with the meta problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is just back to the first thing you said. How have you been trying to make progress on the meta problem? Because one great thing about the meta problem is it's an empirical question. I mean, obviously, plenty of work for philosophers to do to sketch how the answer might go and how it affects how we think about consciousness. But yeah, are you trying to build an empirical theory of why, for example, children are disposed to wonder about color inversion and philosophers are disposed to be dualists, and the whole suite of behaviors that we would like some satisfying explanation of?
I'm certainly speculating on this, and I mentioned the stuff that I'm talking about. I've been talking about the action schema, which builds on work that Michael Graziano has done on the attention schema, which I think is also relevant to the story. I've been focusing more on a broader brush attempt to get people to reconceptualize consciousness, which I think is a precondition for people starting to do this sort of work. I mean, I think a lot of neuroscientists are still following dead ends in thinking about consciousness. So one principal activity is that the second one I mentioned at the beginning, trying to persuade people to think about consciousness in a way that makes the meta problem center stage. But yes, I'm doing some sort of theory sketching in that area, but it's a hugely interdisciplinary thing. Mm-hmm. And this is something that we need a big collaborative project on. I'd really like to see that get funded, and I'd love to be involved in it.
Same here, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think another angle on this is, if you're familiar with Andy Clark's work that combines a predictive processing story with, he draws on elements from Daniel Dennett. Daniel Dennett has a story about consciousness as a matter of tracking affordances in the world around it, the opportunities for behavior that things present. So, the banana presents the opportunity for eating and so on, whatever it is. And this, I think, this feeds into the story that I'm trying to develop about a reaction schema. Again, we track affordances by being sensitive to the patterns of reactive dispositions that things are creating in us, which tell us about their affordances. So that we not only track the affordances, but are able to track our tracking of the affordances. So it's not just that this thing affords some sort of action, but we're aware that it affords that kind of action and therefore can communicate that to other people. Sorry, that was a bit compressed. Anyway, and Andy Clark's got a version of the story which is done in terms of predictive processing, which I think is a paper called Bayesian Qualia, which is a lovely paper, with Carl Friston and another person whose name I forget. Sorry. And I think there's gradually the shape of a new consensus is beginning to emerge here. But what we need is a big organized research project on it. And if I can do anything to help promote that, I'd be glad to.
And just to plug some work by Buck Schlegeris and Luke Muehlhauser. And we've talked some about this, Keith, an illusionist software agent, which is trying to build at least a toy model of some meta problem processes.
Yep, that should feed into it too. Absolutely. It needs to be. One of the problems with thinking about consciousness is that it's been too fragmented. Philosophers, I think, have a lot to contribute to it, but I don't think we've contributed to. Well, okay, I don't want to be too controversial here, but I think philosophers have done a lot to. I was going to say that we've done a lot to direct people down dead ends, and I think that's true. Though exploring those dead ends isn't necessarily a bad thing, since it shows you their dead ends and helps you to find better ones. I think that I've written about panpsychism recently, and I'm quite fascinated by panpsychism because I think if you take this the hard problem intuition seriously, this strong kind of phenomenal realism, then panpsychism looks like a very attractive option. And that, for me, is a sort of modus tollens and a reason for not taking that conception seriously. So I think it's interesting to explore these avenues. But the point I was trying to get to is that it's been too fragmented. Philosophers have been driving in one direction. The neuroscientists have. There were certain fairly exclusive programs in neuroscience. There's the Integrated Information Theory program, higher order thought programs, global workspace programs, and these are largely seen as competing. And there's I think what I'm trying to get at here is that there are different paradigms that are driving work, different and incompatible paradigms, and we need a new paradigm within which people can work together.
I think this might be an instance of a kind of general pattern where the question kind of lies at the boundary between two or more disciplines. In this example, maybe the philosophers often lack some of the kind of useful technical expertise, but the folks in the more kind of technical disciplines like cognitive science or something, or even neuroscience, the kind of funding story's a bit tricky. It's going to sound a bit weird maybe to funders. Maybe it's going to be difficult to kind of publish. So it's like not obvious that I should move into like asking these big questions about consciousness, and so the incentives just never line up, and it's like a real shame.
This is something that's puzzled me for a long time. Daniel Dennett outlined a pretty clear program, I think, of this kind, of this illusionist kind, 30 years ago. And although Dennett has had a huge influence, I don't think anyone would deny he's had influence, it hasn't really translated, I don't think, into the sort of concerted scientific research program that it really needs. I think scientific work has been much more limited. Paradigm was the wrong word there, but it's specific theoretical approaches like IIT that are really quite restrictive. There's only one way that sort of program can go, in that it can either sort of validate itself or it can't. There's no way of integrating it with other stuff. It's a very, very tightly specified program. And I don't think that's the way to go with consciousness at the moment. We need the right kind of conception of what it is we're trying to study, and then we need to have all options on the table, I think. I think something like IIT is leaped way beyond what is warranted by our understanding of the problem. I mean, it's couched within a realist framework anyway.
If people have been working on consciousness in a realist framework, here's a naive thought. Can't you just port that over and say they thought they were looking for the neural correlates of consciousness, say? In fact, they were looking for the neural correlates of processes that explain our judgments that we're conscious. Because clearly there is some difference between processes that result in these reports and those that don't. And you could just say global workspace theory was trying to find those.
I don't think it's as simple as that, no. First of all, you need to make a distinction between first-order consciousness and then whatever meta-problem processors lead us as reflective creatures to develop this conception of consciousness. Now, I'm inclined to say, that consciousness, the contested term, but the way to keep using the term consciousness is to use it for those first-order processes, which we'll find widely spread in the among other animals. And I'm happy to talk about processes of this kind, or basic processes of this kind, pretty much throughout the animal world. And I think they're going to be graded and messy and complex, and there's all kinds of different aspects to them, and you can test for specific aspects and certain sorts of discriminations that are involved in being conscious in this way, but sentient, we might say. You can devise all different kinds of tests, behavioral tests, if we're dealing with non-humans, and you'll get positive results on some tests and negative results on other tests and whatever. It's a huge, complex, messy kind of pattern of sensitivity and reaction to the world, and it's not clear-cut and hard-edged, and asking, is this animal conscious or not is a meaningless question, because it's not a hard-edged thing. And then you have the meta-problem processes that generate our particular conception of consciousness. And they're probably, in their sort of full-blown state, they're probably unique to humans. They may well be unique to humans. But I don't think that's of any great, we can get on to ethical issues here, I don't think that's of any great ethical significance. Now, what are you looking for the neural correlates of? If you're looking for the neural correlates of first-order consciousness in this sense, well, pretty much everything's involved in it in some way. And you don't need to look for the correlates. You can just look for the mechanisms that perform the relevant functions. You don't need to bother with correlates anymore. You can just find the mechanisms that do the work. We only talk about correlates because we can't conceptualize the thing in functional terms. And similarly with the meta-problem things, again, we don't need to look for the correlates. We look for the mechanisms, the systems that produce these relevant the beliefs and so on in question. So we stop looking for correlates at all, and we conceptualize what we're talking about in functional terms, and then we look for the mechanisms that perform the relevant functions. And I mean, I'm very impressed by particularly Liz Irvin's work on measuring consciousness. And the point is that what you find is that different measures of consciousness, verbal report, eye direction, button pressing, under different kind of conditions, they don't agree. And why would they agree? They're measuring different things. They're measuring different kinds of reactions. It's only if you assume there's some kind of hard-edged thing here, the light either being on or off, and which of these correlates with the light being on, that this question really makes any sense. The question of the neural correlates is sometimes which of the bits are essential to making the lights come on? The lights don't come on, so it's a silly question.
Yeah, so at the Future of Humanity Institute, which is where Finn and I both work, we think a lot about whether AIs could feel pain, could suffer, could experience pleasure, and how we would know when we've reached that stage, and how we should act in light of this. It's not news to you or to any listeners that AI is getting increasingly big and complex and sophisticated, and at a certain point, we're going to have to face the question of, do they deserve concern, moral concern? The term moral patienthood is one that philosophers use. That's just the question of what things we should extend concern for. So my question for you, Keith, is a lot of people draw a natural intuitive connection between consciousness and moral patienthood. People seem to think it really matters which animals feel things, which animals experience things, which animals feel pain or feel pleasure. And that's also a natural way of thinking about the problem of AI. When would we have AIs that can experience things, and how would we know? But you don't think consciousness exists. So how do you think about the problem of AI consciousness, animal consciousness for that matter, and its relationship to moral patienthood? Just a small little question for you there.
Well, hang on. You said I don't think consciousness exists. No, I do think consciousness exists. I'm asking people to reconceptualize consciousness. I don't think the kind of consciousness that philosophers tend to focus on, sometimes called phenomenal consciousness, I don't think that exists. Or I don't think consciousness is phenomenal consciousness. I think consciousness is very relevant to ethical questions. And in fact, I think that's one reason for finding the illusionist perspective on consciousness more promising. Because suppose we look at consciousness in the traditional philosophical way as this private inner world. And we also say that it's the existence of this private inner world that really matters ethically. We assume that all other humans have it, though of course we've never actually experienced their private mental world. It's private, but we assume that other people have it, other humans have it. But what about other animals? Well, if they're kind of like us, we tend to think, yeah, they probably have a private mental world. Dogs do, because well, you can just, they're very like us, and they love us and so on. Other mammals, maybe fish, I don't know, they're kind of strange, sort of rather unemotional creatures. Do they have a private inner world? We don't really know. And then get that further down the scale and you think about insects and so on. Probably not, they're just like little robots. But we don't know because, the famous question, what is it like to be a bat? How do we even know it's like something to be a bat? We just, whatever this world of private experience is, we can't access it. We can't even detect its presence. We can hypothesize that it's connected with certain brain processors, and we can look to see if those brain processors are there in other creatures and say, all right, so they are there, say, in fish, and so probably there's this private world going along with them. But we don't. These are just hypotheses. We've never actually been able to test these hypotheses. We can't test them because there's only one instance of this private mental world that we can ever be acquainted with, namely our own. So we're really in a bit of a dead end for answering this question of which other creatures have it. And when you look at AIs, which have their brains, their processing systems are quite different from ours, have we brought one of these private inner mental worlds into existence in creating this AI, or have we not? How do you know? All we can observe are its reactions, the physical processes inside it. So it looks like we've got ourselves into a rather difficult situation in that we've tied ethical value to the existence of this feature, this private mental world. But then this feature is beyond our knowledge. We've no way of detecting its presence. So we seem to have put ourselves in a very awkward position. Now, I think that wouldn't show in itself that it's true. But that wouldn't in itself show that the position is not true. It could be that that's right. That the facts that are central to ethical value are facts that we can't ascertain. Could be true, but it's a rather depressing thought. Now, on the illusionist view of this, the picture is completely different. It's not about having a private mental world. It's about consciousness is a matter of having certain complex patterns of sensitivity and reactive dispositions.
Can I ask a quick question before we move on to the illusionist perspective? I was wondering if I could offer a bit of a reply on behalf of realists who do try to study animal consciousness. So, Keith, you and I have discussed a great paper by Jonathan Birch at the London School of Economics. So that's kind of what's inspiring my thinking here. Finn, we've also discussed it. If you're a realist about consciousness, you can still think that consciousness plays some sort of causal role or plays some sort of mental role. And I think that's what Jonathan Birch thinks is probably true. He has what he calls the Facilitation Hypothesis, that it seems like it might be linked to certain things like multimodal learning and certain behaviors. And we know that that's the case in us. And maybe it's true in animals. And so that at least gives us something to go off of when we go to look for it in animals. There are also various things we can do, like be guided somewhat by structural similarity to the human mind. So all this is just to say, whether we're resting that much on Birch's framework or not, it doesn't seem to me that we're completely in the dark as realists about consciousness. We've put ourselves in a very difficult situation, but not impossible.
A realist about this problematic phenomenal kind of consciousness, I think you are in a difficult position. The suggestion is that maybe consciousness has certain effects, and we can look for those effects. Well, now you have a kind of dilemma. Is consciousness just a physical state of the brain, or is consciousness not a physical state of the brain? Have you got some sort of property dualism, though, these non-physical properties that the brain produces? That's consciousness. Now, let's take the second option. If you say that consciousness is non-physical, but it has effect, then you're saying that you're going to find in the brain physical effects that you can detect, which don't have physical causes, which have causes that are, from a scientific point of view, undetectable. You're going to be saying that the physical world is not causally closed. That could happen, but I don't think there's the slightest evidence for it. We don't find neurons firing without some adequate physical cause. So I think that route, that interactionist route, is not a promising one. The other one, of course, is to say that, well, consciousness in this rich phenomenal sense just it is a state of the brain, but then, of course, you have the problem of trying to make that identity conceivable, to understand how these pure, ineffable fields could really just be patterns of neuron firing. So I don't think appealing to effects is helpful if you're really sticking to this phenomenal conception of consciousness as pure feel. The other point was, you said, well, maybe we can look for isomorphisms between certain structures and consciousness. But again, how do you test for these? Here, maybe it'd be useful to introduce a notion that I've used in a recent paper. The phenomenal conception of consciousness, the conception of consciousness as mental qualities, as pure fields, is a de-psychologized conception of consciousness. And that is, it's a conception of consciousness as something that isn't just a matter of the performance of certain functions, of certain things, certain operations being carried out. It's conceptualized as pure quality, pure feel, what it is likeness of being in whatever functional state it might be. Okay, so there's no conceptual connection between the two. Okay, so you can't deduce the existence of consciousness from the existence of certain functions, certain operations being carried out. So what reason do you have to think there's an isomorphism between them? Well, maybe you can establish it inductively by doing tests and seeing when people are in a certain, when their brains are doing certain things, performing certain operations, they're having a certain experience. The trouble is you can't do this because all you can test for is a correlation between those brain operations and certain reports or reactions that the person might make. They might say, oh yes, I see the light, or they might press a button to say that they see a light, or they might react in some, or their pupils might dilate, or whatever it might be. There might be some physical reactions that you take to be indicative of the presence of phenomenal consciousness. And you can establish correlations between brain operations and those things, but those things aren't consciousness. Consciousness is specifically supposed to be something that can't be characterized in terms of functions or reactions or anything like that. So you cannot do this inductively, and I've argued you can't even do it in the first person by testing on yourself, but the argument for that's a little bit longer. So, and this is why once you take this phenomenal conception of consciousness seriously, the path is open to a kind of panpsychism, because if there isn't any conceptual connection between the performance of certain functions, certain psychological functions, and consciousness, then why do you need a psychology at all to have it? Maybe everything has got this interior aspect to it. Maybe tables and trees and atoms have this private inner world, maybe a very simple version of it. Once you conceptualize it in that way, I can't see any argument for ruling that out. So I do think the situation here, once you locate ethical value in this private mental world, and you conceptualize that private mental world as having no a priori connection with anything that's detectable, then I think all you've got are a bunch of assumptions about what matters, about which kind of creatures matter, and you make your picture of consciousness fit those assumptions. And you say, okay, well, I'm confident that it's there in other animals, not sure about fish, but not bothered about spiders, and I'm sure it's not there in electrons. But those are just a bunch of pre-theoretical intuitions that you have, and you shape your theory about the distribution of consciousness to fit them. There's no way of no principled way of deciding where these private mental worlds are actually distributed.